Hey everybody, I am nutritionist Dr. Mike Roussell, and welcome to today's episode 2 of Friday Fuel Up with Dr. Mike. So if you didn't join us for our first episode, I'll give a brief introduction to myself. I'm currently the nutrition advisor for Men's Health Magazine and a 6-time author. Now I'm a nutrition PhD by education, but over the last 10 plus years, I've been working with, very fortunate to work with world-class individuals from professional athletes to top-tier business executives and even some Hollywood stars along the way. And in helping them figure out how to leverage the power of nutrition to be their best in the field, on the boardroom, or on the set, I've personally learned so much about success, dedication, commitment, and what drives these high-performing individuals. So we started Friday Fuel Up so I could share with you some of these incredible insights straight from some of the best in the world. And today we truly have one of the best in the world and the best out of this world with our guest, who is one of the lead nutritional scientists for NASA. So buckle up, tune in. Today's going to be a great show. So remember, we run Friday Fuel Up with Dr. Mike the first Friday of every month, 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 10 a.m. Pacific Time, right here on the American Pistachio Growers Facebook page. So thank you for joining us. Now today I want to introduce today's guest, who I met actually a very long time ago when I was a lowly graduate student. I was at a conference in San Diego, California, and I met Dr. Scott Smith there. Dr. Smith leads the Nutrition and Biochemistry Laboratory at the Johnson Space Center. Now, the primary goal of his lab is to help determine the nutritional requirements for extended duration spaceflight. He's published over 100 articles and co-authored 3 books. One of them we'll talk a little bit about today, which is Space Nutrition, and I'll link it up in the show notes because you can actually download the PDF of the book for free. And maybe what's even more important to myself and all you other Penn Staters out there is Dr. Smith is also a Nittany Lion fan and a Penn Stater. So, Dr. Smith, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to Friday Fuel Up.
Well, thanks. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to be here.
So, like we did last time, I want to just remind everybody that you can post your comments below, or post your questions below, and we'll pick out some questions and that I'll ask Dr. Scott. And we have some really cool NASA swag to give away. We have NASA hoodies, baseball caps, water bottles, and even women's fleece. So post your questions and we'll ask them to Dr. Scott as they come through. So today, one of the things I wanted to get started with it was actually an interesting tidbit that I picked up from your space nutrition book, is that there are no crumbs allowed in outer space. And I was wondering if you could tell, I know we'll get into more nutrition, but from a food perspective, how hard is that and why can you have no crumbs?
Well, I wouldn't say no crumbs, but indeed they try to limit the crumbs that come off of food. Obviously, you're in weightlessness, so everything is floating, and you can't contain crumbs. So they'll get out of the cabin, they'll float around, they'll get into equipment, they get into the air, they get into your eyes, they get into your lungs, and none of those things are good. So crew members occasionally have asked for specific things to be flown. They came back afterwards and said, no, that didn't work, don't do that again. In the early days of the space shuttle, the early days of the space program, back in Mercury and Apollo, they used to fly these little breadcrumbs or bread squares that they coated sort of with a laminate that you could just eat it. They realized during one of the shuttle missions, they flew a payload specialist who I believe was from Mexico, and he took tortillas with him. And the crew realized that that was the answer to what you needed in spaceflight, because you didn't need to make a sandwich in spaceflight. You needed 3 hands, because you have to hold the 2 pieces of bread and whatever you're trying to put in the middle. And with a tortilla, you could just hold the tortilla and spread your peanut butter on it or whatever. So, you need to realize that the world changes when you're in outer space, and that takes on myriad meanings, all the way down to, in the crew sleep, they have a fan that sits near them to blow the air. Because without convection that we have on Earth, the air doesn't circulate, and you can have pockets of carbon dioxide building up as you sleep. So things that I'm sure you've probably never thought about become really, really important when you get up there. And crumbs and are just one of those things.
Is that because, like, with the sleeping and the fan, because just throughout the normal course of the day, they're moving around, so they're causing the air to move?
That's correct. Well, there are fans on board the vehicle, like space station, for example, that will move the air. But they have a little compartment, it's a little bit like a telephone booth that is their personal space to sleep in. So and when they're in there, there's no real ventilation, so they have to have a fan in there to make sure that again the air doesn't start building up.
That's crazy. So that's really interesting also to know about the tortillas, which I'll have to tell my son because he's obsessed with tacos. And I'll let him know that's the secret to making a sandwich in outer space is a tortilla.
Yep.
Uh, so one of the things that I was surprised as I listened to a couple of your talks and we'd shared some research papers back and forth before the show. I was surprised to learn that vitamin D is one of the only vitamins that are supplemented with in astronauts for extended space. And so one, because I figured that you would actually probably need to supplement with a lot more, so that I was really impressed that the quality of the nutrition that astronauts are provided, would meet all those needs. But the other thing that surprised me was the dose of vitamin D. One of the things, vitamin D is kind of a cure-all, seen in, I guess, popular media as a cure-all for everything. And the doses are generally touted as extremely high, but, it was 800 IUs per day is what's supplemented with astronauts, if that's still correct. And so I was just wondering, like, how are you able to create such comprehensive nutrition profile for these astronauts? And were you surprised that you needed such a low dose of vitamin D?
Well, you got several questions in there, and I'll try to tackle them all. If I get too long, interrupt me. Um, we actually, first off, when we're trying to study things about space, we're always looking for ways to mimic aspects of spaceflight on Earth. So, for instance, if we want to look at bone loss, we put people to bed for months. If we want to look at oxidative stress, we have people live at the bottom of the ocean for a few weeks. And when we wanted to look at vitamin D, the issue with vitamin D in spaceflight is that the food system does not have a lot of good sources of vitamin D, just like our food system. And the crews are not exposed to any sunlight intentionally. So we wanted to find somewhere that we could find people that spent 6 months without seeing the sun, and we went to Antarctica. And we did a few studies in Antarctica where we were in the sun for 6 months, and we tested out different doses, we changed blood vitamin D concentrations, and we kicked around a few different numbers, but we gave 400 international units, 1,000 and 2,000. And after a couple of months in the winter, there really was no difference. The higher dose got there a little bit faster, but then it leveled off. And the lower dose got there, it just took a little bit longer. So when we had been providing 400 IU supplements to the crews on station, and for a couple of reasons, we decided to increase that. And to keep things simple, again, we were flying 400 IU supplements. We told the crew to take 2, which is literally how we got to 800. I think at this point, they're now flying 1,000 IU tabs, just because it's simpler. What I would tell you is scientifically, no difference. The results we've seen are that D with no maintain what many optimal. The idea that you need to take a boatload of vitamin D really isn't warranted. And it's not as exciting as people might like, but our recommendations actually match the DRIs in that the DRIs recommend 600 IUs for your average person that's getting out a little bit, or 800 IUs for people that are not getting sunlight exposure, like elderly individuals, for instance. So we're giving 800 IU supplements with some in the food system, and we see great vitamin D levels. The catch with vitamin D is you got to make sure you don't get too much because you can have calcium issues,
Mm.
and calcium issues and kidney stone risks are one of the we have. So that's sort of the vitamin D story. On the other side, really the biggest challenge we have with astronauts is getting them to eat. That is maintaining energy intake during flight.
Really?
And historically, we've seen a number of crew members that didn't eat as well as we wanted, that lost some to a lot of weight. And what the conclusion we've come to, and we haven't studied this, but my sense is that during spaceflight, your satiety signals are different. And that what happens is when you're in weightlessness, as you eat a meal, it doesn't settle in your stomach because you don't have gravity to keep it down. And therefore, the food is triggering the mechanical receptors in the higher end of the stomach. So your stomach is essentially telling your brain that you're full before you are. So when we meet with astronauts before they go to space station, I've got a 10 or so minute brief that we give them, and the first chart is you've got to eat, you've got to maintain your weight, you've got to get calories in. We built an iPad app that the crews use to track dietary intake, and it shows them at lunchtime how many more calories they need to get before the end of the day to meet their requirement. We track body mass on orbit, and I tell them all the time that, crews have told us when we've nagged them that, look, you're not eating enough. They say, well, I feel fine. I'm eating as much as I want. And I say, look, if you're losing weight, you're not getting enough calories. So our first line of defense is always eat. Once we get enough calories in them, then we start to parse, are you getting enough fluid? Are you getting enough calcium? Are you getting enough potassium? And we work down the chain from there. And we've gotten pretty good at this. We've had crews on board space station for 21 years now, almost 21 years. And we've had a lot of crews that, the flight surgeons will tell you the crews that ate better come out of the capsule better when they bang down in Kazakhstan. It's that simple.
So I have this is actually a great follow up question to what you were saying about digestion and satiety from Larry. Somebody who's watching the interview right now, and Larry was wondering, are there any other ways that digestion is affected by weightlessness? Like you were saying a little bit about those satiety signals. Are there any other ways that it's impacted?
We haven't studied that really well, and that's largely because that has not been. We haven't seen any problems. We're obviously limited by the number of astronauts that are up there and the amount of research that we can do. So we tend to chase, or NASA tends to chase, the bigger problems. The reality is there was a lot of concern when John Glenn flew back in 1963 on his first mission that you wouldn't be able to swallow in weightlessness. And he told people beforehand that he'd stood on his head as a kid and ate and had no problem. He didn't think he was going to have any problem in flight, and he was right. But so after that, we weren't really concerned about it. We have done some studies where we've looked at absorption, and for the most part, nutrient absorption seems to work really well. There is a case where we've actually done some research where your body's calcium absorption goes down during flight. And that doesn't have anything to do with your GI tract. That has to do with the fact that your body is pretty smart. And when you go into weightlessness, your body senses that you're not using your skeleton the same way as you do on Earth. So it says, look, I don't need the same skeleton to hold me up because there's nothing to hold up. So it starts to break down your skeleton. You release calcium, which is one of the things that increases your kidney stone risk. And as you release that calcium, it tells the hormones, it tells your intestines not to absorb more calcium because you've got plenty. So that's a specific case where there are changes in digestion and absorption, but really we haven't seen any problems. There have been some small studies that really need to be validated, which suggest that the transit time through the GI tract is slower, that food takes more time one end to the other. And if anything, I don't doubt that that's true. But if it is true, then the concern about absorption is even less, because what that means is that the food is going to be exposed to the lining of the GI tract for longer, making it more able to absorb the nutrients that you need.
Yeah, so it sort of spaces its own fiber, kind of slowing that digestive process a little bit. Um,
A
so
lot
we
of crews
have
do. A lot of crews. Sorry, I was just say a lot of crews will take fiber supplements
mhm.
um, to help keep things moving, but that's more on an individual basis. We don't do that for everybody.
So we have another question from Laura, and she's wondering, kind of along the same lines of digestion. Are your nutritional studies that you do conducted on both men and women astronauts? And are there any different? Does weightlessness impact female astronauts differently than it does male? I know you were talking a little bit about calcium and bone, and female bone metabolism is markedly different than men over the lifespan. So, are there some differences in weightlessness between men and women?
Well, to answer the first question, we do study men and women. Um, and as I said, when you do a spaceflight study, you're happy to get astronauts to sign up. And what typically happens, the first, whatever, if you're supposed to get 8 subjects, the first 8 that agree to sign up are your subjects. You might get 6 women, you might get 2 out of those 8. Um, we've had some tremendous opportunities over the years to do research, and we've actually collected a fair amount of data on both men and women. And we published a paper, I want to say it was back in 2014, answering that exact question you just asked, which is, are there changes in bone or bone loss or bone changes during flight between men and women? And the answer is no. That women start with small skeletons, they have slightly different bone metabolism, but the effect of spaceflight on the bone is the same. So we have the same concerns for kidney stone risk um, in both men and women. Um, but there, from what we've seen in our data, there really isn't any reason to think that you ought to fly more women or fewer women based on physiological changes.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. I guess I would have expected some difference, but maybe, like you said, it's just a reflection of body size, bone mass, and then maybe even lean muscle mass, but that those aren't necessarily gender specific. They're just kind of
Right.
larger physiological markers. Um, One thing I wanted to touch
And
back on with. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, on a perhaps interesting note, we are right now planning missions to send the first woman and the first person of color off to the moon. And we're planning vehicles. We're going to build them very soon. And in a matter of a few years, we hope to have people on the moon. And I always sort of snarkily say that, whenever you tell engineers to go build a rocket, that 3 minutes after you tell them to build a rocket, it weighs too much. And we spend a lot of our time fighting for food because the first thing the engineers want to jettison is food and water because it weighs a lot. So the argument for women would be smaller, they have calorie requirements, so you would need less food. So if we flew just women, from a mass point of view, life would be better. Let's put it that way.
That's really that's not surprising about the engineers. They want more fuel, and you need more fuel for the astronauts. So one
Amen.
thing I wanted to follow up quick on the vitamin D, because I heard you talk about this in a presentation about some things that you noticed with vitamin D status and immune function, and then there were some parallels, because I know vitamin D, with everything that's been going on with the COVID-19, was became back in the news about its immune function impacts, but that you guys actually discovered some things with your work with astronauts that were relevant to this point.
Absolutely. And actually, that was one of those Antarctic studies that I mentioned. And in one of those studies, we worked with our colleagues in the immune lab here at JSC. And in short, what we found was that there was a relationship between vitamin D status and stress and viral reactivation. So the reactivation of latent viruses. And what we found was a somewhat complicated relationship. But if you had low vitamin D status, and you were stressed, that was associated with greater reactivation of viruses. And last year, again, my colleague Sarah Zwart, who runs the nutrition lab with me, looked at some of the early literature coming out on COVID infections. And we actually published a paper last year based on our evidence from Antarctica, hypothesizing that based on what we know about how vitamin D works with the immune system and the findings that we had in Antarctica, it was reasonable to hypothesize that the course of disease with COVID might be exacerbated by vitamin D insufficiency. And that vitamin D, again, it's not a cure-all. It wouldn't likely prevent you from getting COVID, but what we posited was that it might make the course of infection better. And one step further, black and brown populations tend to have lower vitamin D status. That's a known factor because of vitamin D synthesis in the skin. And we know that black and brown populations are also having a worse time with COVID infections. Are those two things related? I don't know. I don't know if we know. But nonetheless, the pieces seem to lay in place, and we put that out there as a possibility. And I think since then, people have actually done more studies and actually shown that is true, that if you have better nutritional status and better vitamin D status in particular, that is likely better for you in the long run. Again, vitamin D has been touted as the cure for everything in the last 20 years, and it's a lot more important than we thought it was 20 years ago. But vitamin D in and of itself, again, is not the panacea. But it is very, very important. And as with most nutrients, you don't want to be deficient, but that doesn't mean that getting excess is going to be better for you than just having enough.
Yeah, I think so. I think that that's a great message coming out of today's talk for sure, is that it's a reasonable amount of vitamin D. You don't need this, you don't need the mega dose, 30,000 IUs, 10,000 IUs, that it's a reasonable dose and that it can help mitigate, stress's impact maybe on your body's ability to fight viral infections, which is pretty interesting.
Exactly.
So I want one more question, and then I want to get into our pistachio cracking challenge because I'm trying to get my first win here in that part of the show. But one of the things I had also noticed, you're laughing because you're like, you're going to crush me, was you had sent me a paper that was written with your colleagues over in the food sciences department at NASA. I don't know if food science is the proper name for them. But one of the things that I was surprised was I figured, and this is actually maybe my bias coming from the controlled feeding studies that I ran at Penn State, I figured that astronauts would be on a controlled feeding diet. That because space and food and everything was so limited and that they're these high performing, humans, that you could easily be able to say like, look, here, this is what you're eating, go, and then this is what you're gonna eat the next day, and don't complain. But in the paper that you shared with me, it actually made reference to that when you restrict food choices, that it actually led to some decrease in human performance metrics, which I thought was really interesting because for us Earthlings, like if people want to lose weight or get healthy, like the first thing they do is restrict their food choices drastically.
Right. Yeah, no, you're spot on. And again, there's a lot of pieces to what you just said. A lot of people think that we prescribe diets for the astronauts, and the reality is we do not. I probably shouldn't, but I liken this a little bit to we try to fly as good a food system as we can, but it's like packing your kids' lunch and sending them off to school, and you hope they don't trade the sandwich for something else. And the astronauts have very, very difficult jobs. They're in a very stressful environment. They're working very hard. They're far away from home. They're with people they may not know that well. And they do a great job of it. But food is really one of the things that is a great psychological perk. And it's a great team building perk. So to sit down at the end of the day and have a meal together and talk about what you were doing or talk about anything, sort of distract from the environment that you're in, that's really important. So when you think about that, the idea that, I'm going to be writing a diet, which I'm not allowed to do anyway, but the last thing an astronaut wants is to hear from me that they need to eat more broccoli. So we really tend to try to take a hands-off approach. We do track what they eat. We do provide a report to their flight surgeon every week of how they're doing in terms of calories, in terms of fluid, and a couple of other key nutrients. But as long as they're meeting those targets, we don't really nag them. If they're losing weight, if they're not getting as much out of their exercise as they want, a lot of times they will come and ask us for suggestions. And we've got a dietitian on staff. Her name is Holly DeLuey, and she is phenomenal. And we provide really good support for those folks. But again, for the most part, we do our best to stand back. You said, you know, when you limit choices that you needed today and told you this is what you need to eat today, experience shows, and this is terrestrial, it's not even in space, people will not eat what's in that box.
Mm-hmm.
And when we talk about sending crews off to Mars, menu serious. And we need to make sure that the food is as appetizing as can be, is as healthy as can be, is as palatable as can be, because we can't have crews that are losing weight over the duration of a 2.5 year mission. And one of the things that we're really excited about coming up, space station has a lot of perks for it. It's close to home. Okay. So when we send a cargo vehicle up, we put fresh fruits and vegetables in there. The cargo vehicle that just went up recently had ice cream in it. Okay. The crews get to pick about 20%, 10 to 20% of the food items. They get to select what they want. The rest comes from what we call a standard menu. Okay. Those are all really big perks. On a Mars mission, we're not going to be able to do that. And when the question came up of, could people do this for a year or two or three? The answer is we don't know. And right now, we are building a 1,700 square foot habitat that we're going to lock 4 people up in for a year, and we're going to feed them space food to see what happens to dietary intake, what we can do with the food system to make it more appealing, and can crews perform in that environment. We're going to have them do simulated surface walks. They're going to have challenges from a hardware point of view. It is pretty fascinating. We just posted this, I think, last month. There's a website out there now. They're looking at recruiting subjects. So if you've got a year you don't know what to do with, you can come down to Houston, and we'll take good care of it.
That's
But
what
that is
that's what I was going to ask is who are you getting for this? Is this college students looking for a little extra money, or astronauts, or it could be anybody?
well, in a loose sense, it could be anybody. I don't know the exact criteria. I don't think they'll take college students because I think at least having a college degree is a requirement, and you may need to have an advanced degree because they're trying to mimic the astronaut population as much as possible. There'll be extensive medical screening. There'll be extensive psychological screening to make sure that the people we put in there are up to the task. Because the last thing you want on a one year experiment is to have somebody quit after 3 months. So NASA, just like with selecting astronauts, is going to apply probably a very similar set of criteria. And again, that to me is one of the biggest things we have coming up that will really guide as to whether or not we can do this. There's a lot of people that want to go to Mars, and NASA wants to go to Mars too. But you have to realize right now, if we had a rocket that could send you to Mars, we would not send you because there are specific health challenges, and one of them is we don't have a food system that would support you for that amount of time. So it's a lot harder than it sounds.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I can imagine, especially when you're referring to the space station as close to home. The trip to Mars is far from home, to quote the
Right.
Spider-Man movie.
Yeah.
But so all right, so I want to get us two things, and we're gonna run a little bit over if that's okay with you. What would you say is one of the single biggest take homes that you've had from all the studies that you've run in space related to nutrition that applies to us Earthlings?
Well, I'll say two things as quickly as I can. One is we've done a lot of work with diet and bone, because again, bone loss is one of our bigger concerns. We've shown a few things that are important. One is that, in short, crews that ate more fish and sources of omega-3 fatty acids lost less bone. Crews that ate more fruits and vegetables and less red meat lost less bone. And crews that had lower changes in their iron status, that is, not high iron stores, tended to have healthier bones. And all three of those things have implications for people on Earth. The second thing is probably some of the more exciting work that we've done that we're still in the middle of. But about a decade ago, we realized that some astronauts were coming home from space station with permanent eye pathologies. Some of them essentially went up with perfect vision and came back and needed glasses. Some of them, the changes in the back of the eye, the retina, were a little more nuanced. And I don't have time to get into a lot of the detail there, but what we found was changes in the biochemistry of the astronauts that were developing these problems, because not all of them were developing the problem. And what we managed to find was that it was genetically predisposed, and it was related to the genetics that affect B vitamin metabolism, things like folate and vitamin B12, and that those individuals' genetics lead them to have higher B vitamin requirements. And we are lining up an experiment right now to see if for those individuals we can supplement them to mitigate or prevent this problem from happening during spaceflight. And why does that matter on Earth? A clinical population that we found that has very similar characteristics to the astronauts that developed eye problems is women with polycystic ovary syndrome, PCOS.
Wow.
PCOS is the leading cause of infertility in women. It's estimated to affect between 10 and 20% of all women. And while they don't necessarily have eye problems, they have cardiovascular issues that are very similar to what we think are leading to these eye problems. And I had one anecdote from a person who worked at NASA that wrote to me a few years ago. And when I told her about the studies and what we were doing, she wrote and said, look, that 6 or 7 years ago, she'd been diagnosed with idiopathic intracranial hypertension, pressure on the back of her eyes, that they could not figure out what was causing it. That along the way, she was diagnosed with vitamin B12 deficiency. And by the way, oh yeah, she's got PCOS.
Wow.
Now that's one anecdote that could be a fluke, but I really don't think it is. And I think that us working to crack this in astronauts is one example that could have tremendous implications for medicine on Earth.
That's amazing. That is like a connection that you would never, when you wake up to go to work, you're like, never thought you would make that connection. Eye problems in astronauts and PCOS having the same connection. That's unbelievable.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So I want to get to first. I want to thank Larry and Laura for their questions. We'll send you a direct message and arrange for you to get your NASA swag. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for asking the questions. And as we wrap up the show here, I know, Scott, you have some pistachios that we can run our pistachio challenge, which is, and please don't cheat because I had a feeling last time the person was cheating. It's the honor system because I can't see your desk, but we're going to go 30 seconds to shell as many as you can. All right. And we got a countdown timer on the screen and go.
Sorry, it's not fair.
Oh, well, I learned last time I can't talk because when I talk, I can't shell.
I got 1, 2.
Halfway there. I've been practicing.
Already half open.
5, And time's up.
I
What
got
do you got
5.
there? Two, four, six,
I got,
eight. You said you had how many?
so your record is 1. I got 5.
10. I got 11, which definitely beats my record. So you would have, if you would have won, which I'm sorry you didn't, a year supply of pistachios, which I know that there are some restrictions on gifts that you can receive. So we were thinking maybe like a month supply of pistachios that you could share with your lab, and I think we could still definitely swing that. So talk to some growers and get some pistachios for the lab as a thank you within the means of what's appropriate from a gift size. So thank you so much for for coming on the show. I knew that when you and I first kind of had our back and forth interaction, and I was watching some of your talks and reading the papers and reading that space nutrition book, I knew that we could easily talk for 2 hours. And so we've gone over already, and so I appreciate you being gracious with your time, and I thank you so much for coming on. And for everybody who tuned in, thank you so much. We're going to be back first Friday of next month, and we have Jeremy Jones coming on the show next time. He was the National Geographic Explorer of the Year. He's an incredible snowboarder, and he's just done some crazy things in his life. So very looking forward to having Jeremy on and talk to him about kind of what drives and what fuels him. So Dr. Smith, again, thank you so much. You don't know how much I appreciate having you on.
Thanks. It's my pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity.